listening to Crossword, where cultural clues lead to the truth of the word. And my name is Michelle McAloon, your host. You can find out more about me and the podcast at bookclues.com. And we are preparing for the 250th celebration of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. I hope you folks are getting ready. I'll be emphasizing this over the next couple weeks because to survive 250 years as a free republic, you know what? We have done a good job and we've got so much more life in us. I hope you enjoy this book. Would be a great, great graduation gift. And go ahead and give a copy of the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. We all need to read that one more time. Happy listening. God bless. Okay, folks, unless you have been living under a rock, you know that we are coming up on the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And Professor Auslin, how did we say it? A sesquicentennial?
Semi-quincentennial.
Oh, it's almost close. Okay, semi-quincentennial. All right. And we have a great book today. It's National Treasure, How the Declaration of Independence Made America. It's put out by Avid Reader Press. The author is Michael Auslin. He's an American historian, a writer, a policy analyst. He's known for his work on U.S.-Asian relations. He is currently the Payson J. Treat Distinguished Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution in the wonderful, beautiful Stanford University, and was formerly an associate professor of history at Yale University. Stanford's prettier, but we won't tell Yale that. Okay. Since 2024, he has published the Potomac Packet, a Substack containing articles on the history of Washington, D.C., and he is here to talk to us about his book. Welcome, Professor Auslin.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being here.
I'm really glad you're here because this is a big deal. This really is a big deal that we have this document that has lasted for 250 years. It's not just the document, it's the ideas behind the document. It's this fabulous country that we live in that is 250 years old. And folks, I live in Europe and I can see how fantastic we are in the United States. We're not without fault. We've got issues, but I tell you what, we work and we work better than almost any other place in the world. It's an idea, but it's also a very physical document. And you really do a good job of showing why the physical document is important. It has a history and life of its own that is also a part of our bigger national experience.
Yes, the way I think of it are three different lives of the Declaration. The first is what I call the relic, and that is the parchment, the physical, famous parchment signed by John Hancock and the other founding fathers that rests in the National Archives and how it survived. It's an incredible adventure story and a scientific story. So first I talk about that. Why can we still go see it? Secondly, I talk about the life of the Declaration as a symbol, as you said, of what it means to be an American. It is the statement of our creed, of our beliefs. All men are created equal, and we have rights and responsibilities to the nation. All of that, I think, is encapsulated in different ways in the Declaration. And then the third life is the life of the Declaration as a cultural object, which is a really new way of looking at it, but one that I found fascinating. It keeps the Declaration in our minds and in our hearts in ways actually literally in front of our eyes. If we put it on the wall, I have a couple hanging on the wall behind me. We put it on T-shirts. Sometimes we put it on plates. We have all these different ways of having turned it into a commodity, but that serves as a bridge, I think, between the relic that's in Washington, D.C. and the symbol that's in our head. So those are really the three lives of the Declaration that I talk about in the book, and I trace them through our history and how each essentially came to be what it is today, because it didn't always start out as the great statement of American symbols. That didn't come until sometime in the 19th century. It wasn't always a commodity that you could buy. That also developed in the 19th century. And the relic, we almost lost it multiple times. So I trace the lives of the Declaration through our 250 years.
You really do. You weave it actually a very fascinating story. Let's begin with the very beginning. How was it physically written? We know 33-year-old Thomas Jefferson, and as you put out, he was a quiet man at the initial Continental Congress, but he was probably one of the most well-read men in the United States at the time. That's a real good hint for a lot of people these days. Being well-read is a good thing. Let's talk about one. How did it come about? We kind of all know the general history, but how did he put pen to paper on this, or pen to vellum, shall we say?
He actually did put it to paper. That the vellum came later, and we can talk about that. But what happened was Congress, the Continental Congress, is getting close to taking a vote on independence, and the leaders of the Patriot Party, the independence movement, John Adams and some others, they know they're going to win the independence vote, but they really want it to be unanimous. They want all 13 colonies to be on board because that'll just, it'll show a united front to Britain. And so they decide they're going to take a 3-week recess in June in order to try to get the stragglers, because there were some colonies who were straggling, like South Carolina, Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland. They wanted to get them over onto the independence side. They take a 3-week break, but before they do, they appoint a number of committees to do critical things that they want to start taking care of right when they come back for the vote. Right? So they want to hit the ground running when they're going to reconvene on July 1st. One of those committees is to draft an announcement that America is now an independent country, right? No one had ever done that. No one had ever declared a country. No one had ever said we're a country, right? Either you were or you weren't, right?
That
Britain
makes
was a
sense,
country.
right? Yeah, sure.
France
Yeah.
was a country. Russia was a country, but
Right.
no one had ever said, well, we are now a new country. They have to get this statement out to the world, but also to Americans. And as John Adams later said, much later in life, he said, you know what? At the time of independence, only about a third of the British colonists were in favor of independence. A third were opposed. And in good American fashion, a third had no opinion whatsoever. So you had to make a statement for them, too. You had to inspire the ones who were already fighting. You had to try to convince the ones who were on the fence, and you had to maybe try to sway the ones who weren't in favor. You need a statement of some kind. So they form a committee, and it happens to be a committee of some real heavyweights. John Adams is on the committee. Ben Franklin's on the committee. Roger Sherman of Connecticut is on the committee. And Robert Livingston of New York is on the committee. And the fifth and final member is Thomas Jefferson. Quiet, basically untested, wasn't known well, except from some of his writings. He had made some important writings like The Rights of British North America that came out in 1774. But for whatever reason, and there are different stories, Jefferson gets the pen. Ben Franklin said he would never write anything a committee would get its hands on, so he wouldn't write the thing. Two of the others, Sherman and Livingston, weren't all that. They were busy with other things, weren't all that interested. So it's between Adams and Jefferson. And Adams insists that it was he who gave Jefferson the pen, saying, you write better than I am. Nobody likes me. And, Massachusetts has been a bit of a troublemaker. We should have someone from Virginia heading up this whole process. Yeah. So whatever the truth is, Jefferson gets the pen. But this is not the only thing he's doing. We have this, heroic, I love the image. It's a heroic image of Jefferson by candlelight writing the Declaration. The truth is, he's on 4 other committees. He's busy, and he takes only a few days to write this. John Adams says 2 or 3. Looking at Jefferson's own records, it looks like it maybe took him about a week at the most. And he comes up with a very long, very impassioned draft. He gives it to the committee of 5. And they make some changes. We don't really know exactly what they made, but we know some of them. One of the most important ones, I think, is in the very first line. Jefferson had written, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for a people to separate themselves. Franklin changes this to one people, which means that even though there are 13 sovereign states, they comprise one people, meaning from the very beginning it becomes a document of unity, which I think is very important.
Yeah, that is important. Yeah, very important.
And then the committee does whatever else it does. Again, we don't really know for sure. Jefferson, we know, however, writes out what he calls a fair copy or a clean copy and sends it to Congress on June 28th. That's, by the way, the moment that is immortalized by John Trumbull in his famous portrait, but we also know that's a complete historical manufacturing. It's a myth of what he's basically creating a scene that didn't exist, although it's still, one of the most important paintings in American history. So Congress gets the document. They reconvene on July 1st. On July 2nd is the big day, the day that all of them thought would be the most important day, which is the day that they all think will be remembered forever, July 2nd. That's the day they vote for independence. So in the minds of the Continental Congress, they are now a free nation. But the second that they vote for independence, they turn to Jefferson's draft. They got to get this announcement out. And they wind up cutting about a quarter of it, making dozens of changes. Now, unfortunately, we don't know that process. We don't know who suggested what or how it was debated. We only know what happened in what was done. And there were two major things that occurred, both of which really upset Jefferson. The first was that Congress took out a long, passionate condemnation of the slave trade. The second is that they take out a long, passionate ad hominem condemnation of the British people. And then they do other things. There are 27 charges ultimately in the document. They cut some of what Jefferson writes. They condense others. They soften others. They add more references to God, by the way. Jefferson had a couple of references. They add several more, the divine judge and supreme being and the like, to make it really sound more like something I think someone in the 18th century would expect. And then they adopt it. Now, Jefferson hated this initially. He called these mutilations of his document. But by the end of his life, he recognized that the edited declaration that was adopted on July 4th was much better, ultimately, than what he had written. And I think we can say that because he asks for the words author of the Declaration of Independence inscribed on his gravestone.
Interesting. Okay.
So he clearly comes to understand that, and what's actually quite rare in committee history is that a big committee did a great editing job. And it turned this into something that lived forever.
One of the things that you really mentioned in your book, and I was really glad to see that you drive this home, is that our revolution did not go the way of the French. And there were some reasons because we were based on, it's actually, you call it a very conservative document. Explain that. I think that it was, and you do a nice job in the book of explaining that.
Thank you. Well, I think that to the minds of the founding fathers, the signers of the Declaration, they understood they were rebels, but I don't think they felt they were revolutionaries in the sense that they were trying to conserve their liberties. They were trying to conserve what they believed were their rights as Englishmen living in North America. And these were rights that came from God. It wasn't that they were inventing new concepts of rights. And their fear, and the whole reason that they were engaged in this glorious epic of theirs, this moment of fighting the greatest, empire on earth, the reason that they were engaged in this glorious enterprise of fighting the greatest empire on earth is that they felt those rights were being taken away by king and parliament. They felt it was a great conspiracy against them. When they were writing the Declaration, they were actually, Jefferson writes it, then they edit it. They were actually bringing forth ideas that had been circulating in the colonies, sometimes for decades, but more particularly over the past decade since the British began trying to control them more. So later in life, Jefferson explicitly acknowledges this when he states that he felt it was his job in the Declaration, writing the Declaration, not to write things that had never been thought or said before, but to make it an expression of the American mind.
Okay. And Adams in his John Adams must have had a heck of a personality because that's what everybody always talks about. But I think in later years that he made that accusation against Jefferson, didn't he? That he was just copying ideas that were already out there. Jefferson was a big admirer of John Locke, but it's interesting because the U.S. Constitution actually didn't embody Locke. It embodied basically British law and biblical concepts, and it didn't go towards Locke. So it's interesting that the two different documents sort of have two different philosophical sources to it, which I've always found interesting.
Yeah, the Declaration was not intended to be a governing document. And in fact, they knew explicitly they couldn't do that because you would probably not get all the colonies on board if you tried to do something that set up a government for a group of sovereign states that weren't ready for that. That was the job of the Articles of Confederation. But, in particular in the Constitution is the concept of the separation of powers, and that's coming from different sources, but very well known. Montesquieu, the French theorist, influences that as well as others. Locke is certainly influencing Jefferson with concepts of natural law and natural rights, rights that are derived from God, but so is the Bible, as you point out, and English common law as well. In the charges against King George, it's really drawn in many ways from English common law, saying you can't just station soldiers in houses. You can't not assent to our laws. You can't prevent our assemblies from meeting. So there are all of these sources, this Judeo-Christian background that is interpreted through a Protestant frame, English common law, and Enlightenment philosophy of nature's God and natural rights, all of which are present in American thought and which Jefferson brings into the document in a way that makes it immediately understandable and acceptable to Americans. If he had written something new, then they would have started debating that. They would have said, wait, what is this? And why is he talking about that? No, he was actually saying stuff that had been said over and over in pulpit sermons, had been said in colonial assemblies, had been said in public gatherings. And that's why the document at that time had such extraordinary acceptance and power.
They get the corrections and then they write it out. You talk about a guy named maybe Timothy Matlack who actually scribes it out, right? On a piece of paper at this point, or if at this point is it on the scroll? Tell us a little bit about the history of it.
Sure. What happens is Congress, as I mentioned, debates the Declaration draft on the 3rd. On the 4th, most likely in the morning, later recollections said they debated all day and it wasn't until the evening, but more likely in the morning, based on some contemporary records, they adopt the Declaration. At some point during that day, someone, we don't know who, I think it probably was Jefferson, takes the piece of paper that Congress adopted, right? Remember, things had to be printed out in shops, and then you would have that. This was handwritten. This was his fair copy with all of the edits, everything crossed out, everything written in. We don't believe that the document was rewritten. We don't know for sure, but it was brought over to the printer, John Dunlap, who was a few blocks away.
Oh, okay.
And he was given an official commission by Congress, print up this declaration as fast as you can because we're going to start sending it out. We have to send it to the Army. We have to send it to George Washington, who's heading up the Army in New York. We have to send it to the colonial assemblies. We need people to know that this is what we've done. So on the night of July 4th and into the morning of July 5th, John Dunlap prints up what are called broadsides. Today we call them the Dunlap broadsides, probably about 200 or so, sends them back to Congress, and Congress immediately begins sending them off around the colonies with dispatch riders. These are horse riders getting the word out as fast as they can. But even so, it takes weeks to reach Georgia. It takes weeks to reach up to Vermont. A lot of places don't hear about it until the end of July or even into August. They don't even know that it's a new nation yet. And then this gets picked up and it gets printed, and now people start learning about the Declaration. It's put in newspapers, and then local printers print up their own copies of the broadsides. Congress is really busy, though, and for the first month, they don't even think, well, maybe we need to put this in more permanent form. But finally, in August, they decide, you know what? We need to have it formally written out. So that's when they turn to a man named Timothy Matlack, who was probably their number one scribe. He was a calligrapher, and as you can tell from when you look at the Declaration, had a very fine hand. And they give him this commission, but it's short notice. It's actually, the commission actually comes in the middle of July, and he has to get it ready within about 2 weeks or so. And if you look at it, it's beautifully written. It's not going to be done in a day, that's for sure. So he needs to take some time to do it. And yet it has to be done right away. So he we don't know because nobody kept notes, but we assume he rushes out into the markets and he finds the best piece of parchment, calfskin vellum that he can find. But later experts, conservators, people who really know these materials said, you know what he found wasn't so great. It wasn't the best quality, but he didn't have time to make his own, right? Where you would dry it and scrape it and stretch it. He had to buy what was at hand. So he buys it. He begins writing this. And on August 2nd, they finally begin signing it. What's interesting is that by that time, some of the men who were in Philadelphia on July 4th are no longer there. They're off back home. They're fighting with the army. They're doing different things. On the other hand, men who were not there on July 4th, so themselves were not there at the adoption of the Declaration, are now in Philadelphia and add their names to it. So there's a whole mystery about who actually was there on the day of the vote, when was it actually signed? Some people claim it was signed on July 4th, but most of the evidence shows that it wasn't. Some later claimed that there was a conspiracy to hide the true date of the signing and retroactively make it July 4th. And then the upshot of all of it, because they're busy, they're not thinking we have to keep these very tight records. The upshot of all of it is that the day that they all thought would be the really big day, July 2nd, very quickly shifts over to July 4th because somebody decided to put at the top of the very first printing in Congress July 4th, which was literally true, but at the same time hid the fact that they had voted on July 2nd. And then later, when they signed the actual parchment and they're all putting their names on it, it says in Congress July 4th, not August 2nd. So there's all of these mysteries that sometimes people back in the day thought were conspiracies of their own kind, that the founders didn't want people to know exactly when the vote had been taken or didn't want people to know that the document wasn't signed on July 4th. To me, it just humanizes the document. We think of it in this very staid way, but it was part of this period of incredible activity that was never ending, was actually not assured of being a success, and ultimately becomes mythologized, so that we have the children's stories that not only was the parchment signed on July 4th, but the Liberty Bell was rung on July 4th.
Yeah, sure.
And none of that's true, but all of that is wonderful because they became the shared stories of the moment of our founding. So there are 26 that survive today.
Okay.
26 that are known of. I mean, there may be some out there, and occasionally there are wonderful treasure finds of them, and they sell for millions of dollars now because there's only 26 of them. Though you can buy your own cheap reprinting, but faithfully done, on an 18th century reproduction press. Pardon me, I have one right on my wall. So it's actually not that hard to see them if you want to. I've actually seen probably at this point about half of the Dunlaps that exist, but it's very easy right now to go see them, especially this summer. If you're in Washington, D.C., come to the National Archives. They have a wonderful exhibit on the Declaration called Free and Independent. And there, they not only have one of the Dunlaps, they have the very Dunlap broadside that was pasted into Congress's own journal. So it's the very one that they sort of made their official copy. You can also see it I don't know when it'll be off exhibit, but up at Yale University at the Beinecke Library, they have one on exhibit right now. I'm sure there's one in Philadelphia, though I can't remember where. There is one at the Museum of the American Revolution right now at Philadelphia, but I thought there was a permanent exhibit. There may not be. If you're in the middle of the country, Indiana University at the Lilly Library has one. If you're at the University of Virginia, they actually have two of them. And one is always on display in the wonderful Albert H. Small Declaration of Independence collection at the University of Virginia. That's always on display, so you can always go see that. Also, if you're in Washington, D.C., if you're in the Library of Congress, you can see the copy that was sent to George Washington in New York. Unfortunately, only about 2/3 of it survives. The bottom half is ripped off, or the bottom part is ripped off. So it's actually not that hard to see these. Oh, and by the way, it's coming up, ending soon, but if you're also in Washington, the Society of the Cincinnati is showing a Dunlap that is actually owned by the Society of the Cincinnati of New Hampshire. That I think goes off in June sometime. So it's
So
not.
where did you see the Dunlap, though?
I've seen all of the ones that I've mentioned.
How about it in a certain judges' chambers?
Oh, no, that's not a Dunlap. That's a
Oh,
different
that's
one.
not Dunlap. Oh, okay,
No,
no.
that's a different one.
Oh,
Yeah,
all right.
that's called the stone engraving. So the Dunlaps you can actually see. They're not that hard, but it is wonderful to see them. The stone engraving is different. The stone engraving was done between 1820 and 1823 on the orders of John Quincy Adams, who was the Secretary of State. And his worry was that the official engrossed signed parchment, the one that we were talking about a little bit earlier, was in such bad shape that it probably would not survive for another generation. And they didn't know how to save it, but he felt what they could do is basically do the equivalent of taking a snapshot of it. He gets an engraver who, ironically, probably lifts off some of the ink from the
Yeah.
document,
Oh my
further
gosh,
harming
made it
it.
wet.
Yeah, the wet process.
You wanna
Yeah.
scream, "No, don't do that, don't do that." Right, yeah.
But you have to do that, so to speak, to transfer it to a copper plate. And then you engrave the copper plate. So today, when you see a reproduction declaration, when you buy your kids an antiqued crinkly one, or you buy a nice expensive one that's on nice paper, but we're talking the handwritten one, the one that has all the signatures, that's coming from the stone
Okay.
engraving. So stone also engraves about 200 of them on parchment itself, and then does many more on paper. And partly he's going to sell it to a guy who's making a collection of American documents. They're going to put it in the documents. It's sold to others. But today there are about 50 stones that survive. And I was able to see the one in the Chief Justice's chambers.
There you go.
What happened was when John Quincy Adams commissioned the stones and these 200, he gave orders that 2 would be sent to the Capitol, 2 would be sent to the Supreme Court, 1 would be sent to the president, 1 would be sent to every surviving signer at the time, which only then was his father, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Charles Carroll of Carrollton. They sent it to the governors and the state houses. They sent it out to the people they felt needed to have it and who could also potentially show it to the public, particularly in the state houses. Well, it turns out that the Supreme Court got 2, and at this time, the Supreme Court is in the Capitol. So Congress has its own copies, but the Supreme Court has its copies. When the Supreme Court moves to its new then building, 1935, one of the stones comes with it, but one has disappeared. So there is this stone that's hanging up in the clerk's office for decades. And then they decide in the 1990s to redo the clerk's office, and the stone disappears. And it's forgotten. And people forget that this was hanging there until one of the curator's clerks at the Supreme Court remembers and says, we used to have a stone. Where is it? And they have to go search for it. And in the mid 80s, they find it. And it had been put behind a filing cabinet during the renovations and promptly forgotten for years. So they find this thing. I may be getting my dates a little mixed up. I think it's found in the 90s, if I remember now. It's a 200-year history, 50-year. I have to go back and look sometimes at the dates. But anyway, the point is they do find it. I've got the dates right now, Michelle. So it disappears, so to speak, in the mid 90s. They find it in the mid 2000s. So it's gone somewhere around a decade. And they think they found this new stone. Well, it turns out, they had it all the time. They had just lost track of it. But they put it on display, and then Chief Justice John Roberts asks for it to be put in his chambers, and it is. And he very kindly allowed me to go in and look at it as one of the, next to the Dunlaps. I mean, the stone really, and the original stone engraving really are cultural touchstones. And if you go to Washington, D.C., again, I highly encourage it. The National Archives has another exhibit. So I mentioned the Free and Independent exhibit. They have another exhibit that's called The American Story. That's a permanent exhibit. And in there, the original stone copper plate has been cleaned, refurbished, and put on display. You can actually see the plate from which all of these printings came. And next to it, the philanthropist David Rubenstein has donated one of his stones. He owns about 10 of them. He donated one of the original parchment ones So
Okay.
you can literally look at the plate and the engraving itself from which it came, the engraved or the printed parchment, and it's a wonderful exhibit. So I really encourage folks to go this year, this summer. And if I may say one more thing, the Library of Congress will have an exhibit on the Declaration that opens in July. They will have on display for the first time in, I think, 50 years since the bicentennial, Thomas Jefferson's handwritten draft, the one that we were talking about. He kept his draft with all of its edits and all of its annotations. It went down through his family. It was then sold to the U.S. government. It's in the Library of Congress, and they will be putting it on display. So please go see that this summer. And hopefully the book, if you get the book, it'll walk you through all of the history so you'll fully understand what you're seeing.
If you're going to read one book this year to celebrate the 250th celebration, read this book. I mean, this book really is, it shows in many ways the Declaration has made our history, but it's also been a witness to history. And you actually show how it has been a witness to history. You know, in 1814, Dolly Madison didn't rip it out and take it, with the John Trumbull and, and the china and pack it in between the china.
The
That,
George Washington portrait, yeah.
right, that's right. The myths that go behind it. And one of the more poignant points of your book, you show how Abraham Lincoln, I mean, that poor tortured man, the Declaration really was the animating force behind his actions, behind trying to keep his country together, trying to get rid of slavery, trying to keep the Union together. You really do a great job of showing really how he interacts with the Declaration and what impression that made upon him.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, it is very moving to me to read, to have learned about Lincoln, to have understood how important the Declaration was through all of his life, but how it really was the reason he became president. I mean, his political career was restarted after the Dred Scott decision of 1857, and also 3 years before that, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which he thought were mutilations of the spirit of the Declaration and had to be fought at all costs. He creates his entire political program around living up to the Declaration as he understands it. And when he's on his way to Washington for his inauguration, he stops at Independence Hall. He's talking about the Declaration and saying, I never had a thought that didn't emanate, a political thought that didn't emanate from the Declaration. And then he says, and I found this extremely moving in hindsight, of course, he says, I would rather be assassinated than give up these principles.
I know. Oh my
And of
God.
course, 4 years later, he is, and his body is then brought back to Independence Hall. And it's so incredibly moving. He gave up his life for those principles. But in doing so, he not only saved the Union, he forever altered our understanding of the document, making it an eternal and universal document about equality and liberty. And the Declaration that we live with, it's Jefferson's Declaration, but it's very much the Declaration that Lincoln made, as he called it, the apple of gold, quoting Proverbs.
It's just, it is amazing. And you know what is amazing to me? And as I'm reading through this book, the Declaration is still at the heart of our political discussion. I mean, you cannot open up the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal where we're not talking about something on the Supreme Court, where we're not talking about something legislative, where it's being argued on, arguments are emanating for both the right and left about what the Declaration says, about what the Declaration means, about what, it really is it's a phenomenal document. It really, it is. There's nothing like it in the whole world, and how it has animated and witnessed the American imagination. And I would say more than ever now.
I agree completely. We fight our battles, our political battles, on the battlefield of the Constitution, which is the way the system was designed. The Constitution is the governing document, and so that's where we fight questions of equality, separation of powers, the proper role of government, and so on and so forth. But behind all of that, through our history, has been the spirit of the Declaration, whether it's women's rights or, of course, abolition and ending slavery. Whether it is a question of how much power should government have, yeah, well, yeah, you can look at the Constitution and say, well, these powers are enumerated and these powers aren't. But the spirit behind all of that is in the Declaration. It's in Jefferson's phrases. It's in the eternal phrases of we hold these truths to be self-evident, but it's also in the very specific phrases of the charges that still, I think, in some ways sort of inform these are limits to government. It's not saying what government can do, but in charging King George with these crimes as they saw it, it was basically saying what government cannot do or should not do. And that still informs us and it still certainly inspires us. And that's what I hope we take from it in this 250th year, this semi-quincentennial. I hope it's how we think of the document as this great statement of unity, that it is about both equality and liberty, that it is our birthright, whether you were here on the Mayflower or you came yesterday, but you also have a responsibility as a citizen to live up to those ideals. You have to believe in democracy, representative government, all men are created equal, all people are equal, all religions are equal. You cannot hold one above the other. You cannot hold the idea that some have, because of whatever reason, have rights that others shouldn't have. And I think it's also a document that makes clear that we only succeed when we do this together. Again, the one people, or pledging to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
Absolutely. I tell you, it gives me chills, actually. I love this document because unfortunately I've seen how I've seen countries where it doesn't work, where things like this don't work. I've lived in a lot of those countries. And let me ask you a question. Do you think there is much, so the bicentennial was such a big deal. Do you think there is as much national attention as there should be around this 250th? It seems muted to me. What do you think? You're probably more in the thick of it, and especially in Washington, D.C., but out here in the hinterlands, it feels a little more muted.
Honestly, it's hard to tell. Each state has 250 commissions. Some of them are very active, like Virginia and Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. Others are doing things. There seems to be a lot of activity. There's the America 250 Commission, which actually licensed this book. It's the only one to be licensed by them, my book. There's also the Freedom 250 Commission, which President Trump set up. There's the Freedom Plane, which is being sent around the country by the National Archives, which is really great with incredible exhibits. There are exhibits in different places. As I mentioned, there's a lot of places. Yale Beinecke Library and the Art Gallery both have exhibits. There's the National Constitution Center has an exhibit. Library of Congress will have an exhibit. National Archives has an exhibit. As I mentioned, University of Virginia has an exhibit. I know Indiana University has an exhibit. So there are lots of things going on. There are lots of activities. I think it does feel in a way more fragmented. And again, we're in a different era. We're in the social media era and we're in the internet
Sure.
era. And 50 years ago, we couldn't do this podcast because they didn't exist, but you would have everyone tuning into one of the big three networks. And so if they did something, it sort of covered everyone, right? Or the few big newspapers, as opposed to now everyone, including me, with a blog or a Substack can be writing about the 250th. So on the one hand, I bet, and there's a lot of books coming out. I mean, my book and Rick Atkinson's second volume on the American
Wonderful.
Revolution and other books coming out. So in some way, I wouldn't be surprised if by volume there's more, but it's much more fragmented because we live in a more fragmented information environment. And so it just may not seem like there's a center. I think, come July 4th, there will be big celebrations and people will probably sort of feel it. I do wonder, and we're a different country from 50 years ago. Things are very contentious these days, but it was contentious in the mid 70s. Don't forget Vietnam, Watergate, assassination. I think it'll take us time until afterwards to sort of, which is a shame, but it'll take us time until afterwards to assess how much it impacted students like me when I was 9 at the bicentennial, right?
Okay.
So
Yes.
how now will kids react next year, 5 years, 10 years, What will be enduring? Like, I hope my book is enduring, but what will be the enduring things that were written about the 250th? I think it'll take time for us to figure it out.
I have to read you one line that I wrote down from your book because when I read it, I laughed out loud. And I think this was after the war of maybe 1814, 1812, maybe. Political paralysis gripped Washington and Congress, all but abandoned its responsibilities, including funding the Army and the Navy. Were you talking about yesterday or 100 years ago? Boy, times have changed and times have not changed. So I
Well,
just had to laugh.
I think through the book, I mean, I felt by the end, having done a 250-year history, more or less, that, yeah, a lot of what I felt is, we've been through this before. We've been through really, obviously, the Civil War above all, but we've been through periods where people said the country's not legitimate, or, quite frankly, the people called Andrew Jackson a tyrant, said he was acting as a despot.
A no
Um,
king's rally, right? I mean, just
Yeah, you absolutely no, they exactly said he's acting like a monarch and a king. They said that about John Adams. Obviously you had times of complete dysfunction in Congress. That what you quoted from is 1814 and the invasion of Washington, where basically government ceased operating and they all fled Washington. These things sort of resonate through our history. We've had terrible, well, of course, I mean, obviously, with the Civil War and leading up, but we've had, terrible race riots in the 20th century, but that ultimately got us to the civil rights movement. And so none of these things that we're dealing with today are new. The iteration may be new, but the themes, I think, go through our history. And at the end of the day, that actually gave me a lot of confidence that our strength is so much more. We all focus on the weakness, and unfortunately today we focus on the outrage, but we have such enormous strengths throughout the country. And we've been through these things, as I said before, and that gave me a lot more confidence and perspective on thinking about it today.
and that is the message of your book. It really, folks, this is a good book. It's not a hard read. It would be a good summer nonfiction read. It really would be because it's easy to read. It's interesting. Like I said, it's a witness to American history. It would be a great gift for graduation, and give a copy of the Constitution in this book to your high school graduate, your college graduate, or a great Father's Day gift. This would be a fabulous Father's Day gift. National Treasure: How the Declaration of Independence Made America by Michael Auslin. And Michael, I really want to thank you for taking time out of, I know, a very busy media schedule. And when I say this, I hope this book is a bestseller. I hope every American reads this book. I really do. This is a book that we need now to understand who we are. And you really do a nice job of explaining that.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle. I really appreciate it.